Returning to our story and Australia's response to the coronavirus, there has been some criticism on whether or not Australia has been slow to act in some of our restrictions. Earlier I spoke with Deputy Chief Medical Officer Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly, thanks for your time. So we're ramping up precautions in Australia now, blocking most entry from China. What changed to make this decision from only a few days ago?
So we are following the situation in China and indeed internationally very closely. We're very closely linked with the World Health Organization and international partners and monitoring what's happening with this virus. So we've known about this new virus from early January in Hubei province, in the city of Wuhan, and then in other cities within that province. But over the last week or so, in fact, on Saturday morning, we were notified of a worrying trend to increasing cases in the rest of China. And so that's why we made that decision announced by the Prime Minister on Sunday.
So the increase in cases, because a lot of people would say, well, that was always going to be the case. The most precautious action would have been saying, let's perhaps get ahead of that and stop this travel a few days ago before this spread, before more travellers arrive in Australia. Why not?
So that's always a difficult question when you think about changing trade and travel and making restrictions like this.
So there has to be an economic consideration.
There are considerable knock-on effects potentially. For example, our university sector has many students from China, around 130,000, and so to block them from coming, that is a big thing, not only for them individually, but for the university sector itself. So we don't take these decisions lightly. What had changed really was a work on modelling, so looking at what we know about the virus, the cases which were relatively small in other parts of China, what might be happening in the coming weeks.
Right.
And so that was really what changes as a precaution for next week and the following week.
Right.
Not so much before that.
So modelling presumably is based on the virus and what we know about
Correct.
it. China was warning last weekend the virus could be passed on pre-symptomatic, and Australia was saying we didn't believe that was the case. 2 days later we said it was the case. Why that indecision? Why not just assume what China warns the first time could well be true and work to that basis?
So I've worked with quite a few different pandemics, and this is the way it starts, with a lot of uncertainty at the beginning. So in SARS it was similar. Where did it come from? How many cases were they? How was it transmitted? Similarly with the H1N1 virus in 2009, we had early reports out of Mexico that many people were dying, and this was a terrible virus. As it turned out, it wasn't actually that severe. So we've been looking absolutely every day, and even every hour things change. What changed our opinion there was really one particular case in Germany where a person who was definitely asymptomatic, so no symptoms at all, was in a workshop with a number of people.
This is the conference, wasn't it?
Correct.
Yeah.
It was a workshop, I think, in Munich, and her co-workers got sick. They'd never been anywhere near China, and it was quite clear that person had.
People would say from that, well, you had this warning from China, and you assumed it was incorrect until you had your own evidence. Wouldn't it be better in this case to assume it was correct? Isn't that a more cautious approach?
So I think in the context of China, where there were many cases, a lot of transmission, it was certainly one of the things we looked at, but there was this particular case where there was no other explanation. That's what changed our mind.
But again, when China initially said, we believe this is happening, and for a few days the official advice, and I think the Chief Medical Officer came out and said, there's no evidence that's happened before with the coronavirus, so we don't believe that's the case. Again, the more cautious approach wouldn't be to, well, it might be true, let's work to that in our modelling, and if we have to go back, we go back on it.
Yeah, look, as I say, when in uncertainty you have to make decisions. Initially our decision was to watch and wait, and then we made that decision to stop that. And look, in the fullness of time we may find that there is no transmission before people get symptomatic. That's typical of coronaviruses, as distinct from flu viruses, for example.
What's the procedure, the point we're at now, in terms of trying to avoid it being passed on?
A range of measures were announced by the Prime Minister on Sunday. That was on advice of the Australian Health Protection Committee, of which I'm a member, with the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Brendan Murphy, and other Chief Health Officers. And so our advice was that because of this increasing number of cases and the modelling showing that's going to continue to increase in China, that we should limit people coming from China, partly because of the risk, but also really the issue of if we have, and we have, in normal times, almost 50,000 people arrive from China every week into Australia. It's large numbers. Many of those are Australian citizens or permanent residents. They can still come. But for tourists, it was becoming difficult to know where to put them in isolation because...
and even just to trust them, stay in your hotel, don't go out anywhere. Well, who's going to come to Australia?
Yeah, so they're large numbers. And when it was Hubei province only, relatively small numbers, direct flights had stopped, we could manage it. But those sort of numbers was going to be difficult. So that's why we took this temporary measure. And
just on the modelling, what does your modelling suggest the size of the virus in terms of spread will get to in Australia?
Well, so far we have 12. There hasn't been a large increase over the last few weeks, but we're continuing to monitor, continuing to test, and I expect there will be more cases. How many that is, we're actually holding a modelling workshop today in Canberra.
Right.
We've invited the very best modellers in Australia to come to work with us on those exact questions.
And that will get a sort of likely a best case, a worst case?
Yes, and we'll look at if in those cases what would be the effect, for example, on the hospital system, laboratory supplies, masks and so forth, and also, and very particularly, look at the international situation as well as within our borders.
So that's just being done now? That's the first time we'll have modelling on Australia?
So it's difficult to model when you only have 12 cases, but this will be looking at what we know so far about the virus in many countries now.
We'll get that information in coming days?
This will be an ongoing effort, and we'll need to take as much information as we can, use it today and start that process.
Paul Kelly, thanks for your time today.
You're welcome.